Right. So today we are continuing the study on the book of Habakkuk. We are in part 2. We will finish chapter 3. There are only 3 chapters to Habakkuk. We'll finish chapter 3 today. So when we ended last week, we were talking about Habakkuk chapter 3 verses 1 and 2. So let's read those verses, because what Habakkuk is saying to the Lord is, do once again what you did before, right? So it says Habakkuk 3:1-2, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shiginon. Lord, I have heard your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. O Lord, renew them, that is your acts, in our day, in our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. So Habakkuk is saying, do again what you did in the past. And here he is referring specifically to the event that took place at the Red Sea and how God delivered Israel from the hand of the Egyptian. Right? So Habakkuk is referring God to that incident and saying, Lord, do the same thing again. Now, moving on to verses 3 and 7, let's analyze those verses as well. The prophet then described the glorious second coming of Jesus, which within his own geographical context. So Habakkuk is describing the second coming, but from his geographical context, right? Because, during Habakkuk's time, there was no United States. It didn't exist. France didn't exist, not in Germany, right? So if God had called a prophet in Germany, he would have described the second coming from the perspective of Germany. Just like that, he's going to, and that prophet would mention things specific to that location, because that was what he was familiar with. So in Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 3-5, we find the same thing. Would someone like to read that verse?
Habakkuk 3:3-5. God came from Teman, the region of Edom, east of Israel, the Holy One from Mount Paran, midst of the Gulf of Aqaba. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise, rays flashed from his hand, where his power was hidden.
Now remember that rays flashed from his side, hands and side, that we will come to that, right? Once again, remember, the prophet is seeing the second coming from his perspective. So remember that every eye is going to see him from all over the world according to other Bible verses. So he is talking about the region of Edom, east of Israel, west of the Gulf of Aqaba, right? Because that is how far he could see geographically, how he could understand it geographically. So he's saying the Lord is coming from those regions, but actually the Bible says the whole world will see Jesus coming. So in other words, his hand, rays flash from his hand or side, as King James Version says. In other words, his power is hidden somewhere there in his hands or in his side, right? That is what it means, rays come. We will discuss that in a bit. Right. Now, in the Old Testament, the Jewish scholar Theodore Gaster translated or paraphrased these verses 3-5 in the following way. Let me read that. Here comes he, a very Godhead, out from Tema, yea, a being divine from the hillsides of Paran. His splendor has mantled the heavens, and the earth is filled with his sheen. It is as the glow of the day spring. Rays shoot forth from his side. Though still in the darkness yonder lies hidden the full force of his strength. Catastrophe is his vanguard. Pestilence brings up the rear. Now these verses contain vivid solar symbolism that serve as a polemic against the Babylonian sun god Shamash. In Babylon, the sun god Shamash, and this is an archaeological discovery, right, is depicted rising between twin mountains with rays shining forth from his shoulder and side. Now, ancient societies believed that the gods were enveloped in splendor or terror, depicted as the light of the sun. For example, in the creation epic Imua Elish, Marduk, that is the Babylonian god, is described as being garbed with the splendor of 10 gods. Now, Habakkuk makes it clear that neither Shamash or Marduk are sources of light. He says they are not the sources of light. He says this description belongs to Yahweh, right? It belongs to the Lord. So the Bible repeatedly portrays Jesus coming from the sunrise to dispel spiritual and literal darkness, right? In the Bible, God always comes from the north and from the east. That is God's compass, north and the east. And the reason why that is because of the position of the sun. The sunlight begins in the east. It reaches its strongest intensity above our heads in the north. And then if you take the opposite, darkness begins in the west and it reaches its deepest intensity in the south or in the underworld. So that's why the Bible describes the loud cry as coming from the north. It comes from heaven, because north is heaven where God is, right? The sealing angel comes from the east, from where the sun rises, in other words, right? Now, Revelation 10:1 describes Jesus, whose face shines like the sun, unsealing the message from the scroll of Daniel 12:4. Let's read that and see.
I saw still another mighty angel coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was on his head. His face was like the sun, and his feet like pillars of fire.
Okay, so we find John portraying Jesus as coming from the east. His face was like the sun. Then if you go to John, Revelation chapter 7, verse 2, here John portrays the sealing angel as coming from the rising sun. And this angel is also described in Ezekiel chapter 9, verses 1 to 6, as the man clothed in linen, a clear allusion to Jesus, who is garbed as the high priest. So man clothed in linen always refers to Jesus in his high priestly robe. Let's read Revelation 7:2. It says, then I saw another angel ascending from the east, Anatole Heliu, that's in Greek, right? Having the seal of the living God. Now, when Jesus comes the second time, he is described as coming from the east with the armies of heaven. That's found in Revelation 16, verses 12 and 13. Someone likes to read that?
Revelation 16, 12, 13. Then the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared.
Now, the translation Kings of the East does not capture the nuance of the text. In the Greek, it's two words. Two words are used to describe the East as Anatole Heliu, meaning from the rising sun, right? So East is from the rising sun. Then the question arises, who are these kings that come from the East? Now, if you go to the sixth plague, which is the sixth plague in Revelation, there are the kings are coming, during the sixth plague, the kings are coming from the east. Now it is Jesus and his angels. In Revelation 19:11 to 14, it's described as saying that Jesus comes sitting on a white horse and the armies of heaven follow him. So once again, under the sixth plague, this is after probation closes, under the sixth plague, it says that the sixth angel pours out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its waters are dried up, so that the ways of the kings from the east might be prepared. Okay? And then we have the testimony of Malachi, which is described in the second coming again. The prophet Malachi used the rising sun terminology to describe how Jesus will dispel spiritual and literal darkness at his second coming. He says there, but to you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings, and you shall go out and grow fat like stall-fed calf. Okay, so Jesus comes from the east, right? And heaven is north because it's up, and that's where God lives, right? So east is from where Jesus comes, a sealing angel comes, a loud cry angel comes, coming from heaven. Now, the preceding and succeeding verses in Habakkuk reveal that the central theme is the deliverance of the righteous and the destruction of the wicked when Jesus comes. Right? We can compare it with verses 1 and 3. Now, Matthew 24:7 clearly portrays the second coming of Jesus from the east. Matthew 24:27 says, for as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. So from where does God come? He comes from the north and he arrives at earth from the east. He comes from heaven, but he arrives on earth from the east. And that is the description here that we find in Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 3 to 7. Now, that's the reason why it speaks about his splendor as like the sunrise. Rays flash from his hands or his sides, as King James Version says, where his power was hidden. So Habakkuk is describing the second coming of Jesus. Now, Mrs. White has this statement in Christ Object Lesson, page 414. Let me read that. The coming of the bridegroom was at midnight, the darkest hour. So the coming of Christ will take place in the darkest period of Earth's history. Now, question for you. Where does the devil come from? He always comes from the abyss, right? From the abyss of the underworld. That's the devil's domain. He lives in the underworld. He comes from what is called the bottomless pit. Now, the French Revolution, as described in Revelation, it comes from the bottomless pit, right? Satan is bound in the bottomless pit. And that's south, the area of darkness. So if you take a compass, God's point in the compass is northeast, Satan is southwest, right? So when it refers in the Bible, remember that when you are reading a Bible and it's talking about these points in the compass, we can understand that. Now, in the midst of the darkness and despair of God's people, when the unruly waters or the tumultuous waters are referred to as the wicked, are swirling around them, and darkness encircles the earth, right? Wickedness and this is just before the second coming of Jesus. Christ will come as the Son of Righteousness to deliver his people from the darkness and the infuriated multitudes who intend to execute the death decree on God's people. Right now, this is after the close of probation. This scenario is vividly described in Habakkuk 3, verse 13 as well. The darkness of the fifth plague will be dispelled by the sun rising in the sixth. Now, during the fifth plague, there is darkness, means Babylon, the wickedness of Babylon is depicted as darkness. But in the sixth plague, Jesus gets ready to come, which represents that there will be, the sun will rise, there will be hope, there will be deliverance for God's people during that, during the seventh plague. Now, moving on. Now, how can we better understand the repetition of the pattern of creation? But okay, sorry, not how, now we can understand, right? But in eschatology, or at the end of time, at his coming, Jesus will smite the darkness of the fifth plague and the subject of swirling waters of the symbolic Euphrates, to prepare for the kings to come from the rising sun of the east. Now, waters, as we have studied before, waters symbolize the dragon, right? And his body of followers. Where does the harlot sit? In Revelation, we know that she sits on the swirling waters of multitudes, tongues, and people. And she is sitting there with the intent on drowning the remnant. She doesn't sit there. Her intent is to drown the remnant. Now let's go for a moment to a reference on this. Let's go to Revelation chapter 12. Let's look at Revelation chapter 12, specifically verses 13 to 17. And notice how the waters are interpreted. Who are these waters? Why are they swirling? Why are they tempestuous? What do they represent? Remember, Revelation is a book of symbols. So you cannot take this literally. At the end of time, they have a symbolic meaning, right? So in prophecy, in Revelation, the waters are never calm, right? They're always represented as tumult. They are, not a nice calm sea, but a very rough sea, right? And we know the sea, if we have studied prophecy, we know the sea represents peoples and multitudes that want to kill God's people. Now in Revelation 12, 13 to 17, this is what it says. Listen. Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast into the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child, right? Now the woman is the faithful church or the faithful remnant, and this is talking about Satan when he was cast out from heaven, right? So to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Now the woman is a church, right? So obviously the woman comes before the child, and Jesus was born from the Old Testament church, right? But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness to a place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the servant. So we find that if you read Revelation chapter 12, Jesus is born in the Old Testament church. The dragon through Herod tries to kill Jesus, but he can't. Jesus lives, accomplishes his birth. He goes to heaven. And then the devil turns his persecution on the seed, the remnant of the seed. The seed is Jesus. The remnant is God's faithful people. So then he turns his attention to persecute God's people. And that's what this is talking. So he's persecuting. This is during the 1,260 years. And then we are told that the earth is, if the sea is our peoples and a place that is highly populated, then the earth has to be a sparsely populated area, right? Remember that. So the serpent spewed out water out of his mouth. Water is the persecutions, to flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman. And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring. And who are these? Who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ, right? So what do the waters represent? The waters represent Satan, his people, and the multitudes that he uses. So I'm catching the picture. It's a very exotic imagery that is used in Hebrew text. We are not accustomed to the type of imagery in the world today, but we speak more like in concrete terms. But in Hebrew and during biblical time, they spoke in very vivid imagery, like we see here. Okay? So now, after smiting the darkness or the unruly water, that is the wicked, as at creation, the earth will be without form or void. So the earth at Jesus' second coming goes back to pre-creation form, right? And then we are told Jesus will recreate a new heaven and a new earth, Revelation 21, 1 and 2, where his people will dwell secure and the light of the glory of God will lead to eternal day in the city. So after this terrible time of trouble that the God's people have, God will destroy the wicked, and then he'll create a new heavens and the new earth. And God's people will be secure there, right? Now, notably, there will be no more threatening sea. The threatening seas are represented as people, right? Revelation 21, 1, Mrs. White described the light eclipsing the darkness in the Great Controversy, page 698 and 699, right? There will be no more sea, right? Revelation says there will be no more sea. What does that mean? Has that ever troubled you? Now, I was always wondered, will there be sea, whether there'll be water, right? What does that mean? They're not going to have bodies of, are we not going to have bodies of water on the earth made new? No. What does the sea represent? In prophecy, sea represents multitudes of tumultuous people who want to destroy God's people, right? We're going to give further evidence. So when the wicked are destroyed, they're not going to be tumultuous people who want to kill God's people. So that is why it says there will be no more sea. Mrs. White we will read that text, what she talks about clearly. So we find that what it means, but also when we take that text, what does it mean? He rides. What is Jesus riding? Does he come riding on a horse, right? Revelation 19 says he comes riding on a white horse. What is he riding? And who is following him, right? So we have this is all imagery, right? Jesus is coming and there are armies of heaven following him. Who are the armies of heaven that are going to follow him? They are the hosts of heaven. The armies of heaven are his angels. So when Jesus comes the second time, he's coming with his angels, right? And what are they coming from? His armies. Jesus is not coming alone. He's coming with all his angels. They're coming to rescue God's faithful people who are under a death decree. Because during the great time of trouble, there is a death decree out, and God is coming to save his people, right? In actual fact, it looks like they're going to perish, but Jesus, Michael, as in Daniel 12, stands up and he comes to deliver his people, comes to save his people. Now let's read Great Controversy, page 640 and 641, which talks about Jesus' second coming. Would someone like to read that?
Soon there appears in the east a small black cloud, about half the size of a man's hand. It is the cloud which surrounds the Savior, and which seems in the distance to be shrouded in darkness. The people of God know this is to be the sign of the Son of Man. In solemn silence, they gaze upon it as it draws nearer the earth, becoming lighter and more glorious, until it is a great white cloud, its base a glory like consuming fire, and above it the rainbow of the covenant. Jesus rides forth as a mighty conqueror.
Okay. So now the righteous will not hide from this glorious light. That's what Habakkuk is saying, right? Habakkuk describes the first stages of the rays of this morning sun of Jesus coming. And as it begins to appear, in the eastern sky, it comes and it begins to appear. Its full glory will be hidden behind the eastern horizon. But Mrs. White says, as Jesus begins to come, the people on earth will see him in his glory, in his full glory, right? And God's people will not hide from that. Now, another thing that in Habakkuk that we read was, the King James states that Jesus had horns coming forth from his hand. Now, because this is the second coming, we have some translations translate that the rays were coming from his side. Some say it was coming from his hand. Now that doesn't make a lot of difference. The only other place that the description raise /4 is found in Exodus chapter 24, verses 29 and 35. And that most description is about when God gave the 10 commandments to Moses. Moses has just been communing with Jesus on the mount. The glory of God is contagious. We have studied that before. Because when he came down, the rays, right? But really the Hebrew word there is horns, right? These are translations. Flash from his face. This is Moses, right? The glory on the face of Moses was the glory of God. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 tells us that. The glory was so great, that Moses was reflecting the glory of Jesus, that the people begged Moses to cover his face, to cover that glory. Now, that's the same glory that will accompany Jesus at his second coming, right? The Gospels tell us that the face of Jesus shone, right? Shone when he was transfigured on the mount. And the transfiguration, we all know, was a small-scale illustration of what Jesus will look like when he comes again. Now, in the Old Testament, the covering of God's glory is called the glory of Yahweh, right? And Mrs. White applied Habakkuk 3, verse 3 and 4 to the second coming of Jesus. Now, notice how Mrs. White describes these verses from Habakkuk in the Great Controversy, page 641. No human pen can portray the scene, nor mortal mind is adequate to conceive its splendor. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise, and his brightness was as the light. There she is quoting Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. Now, what about the rays or the horns coming from his side? What does that mean, rays and horns? The Great Controversy, 674, Mrs. White explains. This is what she says. One reminder alone remains. Our Redeemer will ever bear the marks of his crucifixion. Upon his wounded head, upon his side, his hands and feet are the only traces of the cruel work that sin has wrought. Says the prophet, beholding Christ in his glory, he had bright beams coming from his side, and there was the hiding of his power, quoting Habakkuk 3:4. That pierced side whence flowed the crimson stream that reconciled man to God. There is the Savior's glory. There, the hiding of his power, mighty to save. Through the sacrifice of redemption, he was therefore strong to execute justice upon them that despise God's mercy. And the tokens of his humiliation, his highest honor. Through the eternal ages, the wounds of Calvary will show forth his praise and declare his power. So when Jesus came to this earth the first time, he also arose spiritually as the sun to dispel spiritual darkness, the darkness of sin, right? At the first coming, Jesus is described as the sun that comes to dispel darkness, but it is not literal darkness that is being spoken of here, but that he came to dispel spiritual darkness. And we know, we have the text that says that those who dwelt in darkness saw the marvelous light when Jesus came. Now, however, at his second coming, this glory will be literal and personal, right? It's going to be literal and personal. As Jesus dispelled the darkness at creation by his word and split or divided and subjected the unruly waters that covered the planet, so he will rise as the sun to defeat spiritual darkness by his word, right? When he says it is done, and subject these chaotic waters of spiritual Babylon. So spiritual Babylon, the abominations will be subjected to his word. Jesus will rise like the sun to dispel the darkness of false teachings. Now a sword comes out of his mouth, right? By the way, what does the sword represent in the Bible? In Hebrews, it represents his word. Now, it's not a literal sword that is coming out of his mouth. Once again, remember, this is symbolic, and it is symbolically portraying what is happening. And then also don't think that Jesus is coming seated on a white horse. What it's saying is that he's coming as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So remember, Revelation is all symbolism, even in Habakkuk, which is talking about the second coming. So don't think he's going to tread a literal wine press of grapes. He's coming to trample or destroy the wicked with the plagues, right? The plagues are the wrath of God, because the wicked want to destroy God's people. Now, this is once again symbolic portrayal that indicates reality, right? Is that clear? So when you are reading Revelation, you have to keep that in mind, and also Habakkuk. These are books that are connecting to Revelation. That's why we are studying, right? Now, in order to fully understand the language of Habakkuk, chapter 3, verses 3 to 7, but we must remember what happened literally at creation, right? Now, that's a paradigm for what happens spiritually in redemptive history. The framework of Habakkuk 3 is creation, but not the original creation of the planet, but rather creation in redemptive history, right? We can compare that with 2 Corinthians 5:17, where it says we are new creations, all things are passed away, right? So God originally defeated the darkness and the waters at creation. He delivers his people with glorious light and the drying up of the water in redemption at redemption. And notably, this deliverance God has done once before. And Habakkuk pleads for God to do it again. When Israel had been in a precarious situation at the edge of the Red Sea, there God dispelled the darkness and dried up or divided or split the waters to deliver his people from the wrath of the Egyptians. We can read that in Exodus 14, 20 and 21. But when you read that the account of the Red Sea in the Bible and in Spirit of Prophecy, we are told, suddenly this pillar of cloud that gave light to Israel, right? Shade during the day, light to Israel. Another, when it was on the side of Israel, it was like noontime, right? It was bright. But then all of a sudden, this pillar rises up, right, over Israel and interposes itself between Israel and Egypt and the Egyptians, right? So if you read Exodus 14, as well as the Spirit of Prophecy, you will see this clearly. God's people were surrounded by the glorious light of the noonday sun, while the Egyptians, right, in between Israel and Egypt, the Egyptians, on their side, it was total darkness. They couldn't see a thing. It was like midnight. So there you have the darkness, right? And God's people in light, right? By the way, when Jesus comes, God's people are going to be glorified and be in the light, while the wicked are in darkness, the darkness of the fifth plague, and there is a splitting or a dividing of the Red Sea, or the drying up of the waters to allow God's people to escape. Drying up the Euphrates represents the support that the harlot, right, or the papacy has, dries up. They withdraw their support. Remember, we studied that? So that is the drying up of the river Euphrates. Now, at creation, he divided the waters. At the Red Sea, God divided the waters. And at the end, Habakkuk is saying, Lord, do that again, what you did at the Red Sea. That is what Habakkuk is saying when he's referring to the second coming. So in Habakkuk 3 to 15, it points us backwards to when God dried up the Red Sea, and forwards to the time when God will dry up the symbolic Euphrates and comes as the rising sun from the east with his armies, his angels, to deliver his people from the death decree given by spiritual Babylon, right? And this is going to provide a way of escape for God's people. And then we have the seventh plague, where you have thunders and lightnings and earthquakes, which is the seventh plague in the book of Revelation. And in Psalms, it says that there was an earthquake, there was thunder and lightning when Israel crossed the Red Sea. So that's why Habakkuk is saying, do that again for us, Lord. So you find these same supernatural happenings in creation when Jesus divided the sea and saved them, which is symbolic, it is type. And in the antitype, there's also going to be earthquakes and thunder and lightning when God delivers his people. Now, what happened at creation becomes an illustration or a paradigm of what happens when Jesus comes the second time. Is that clear? So that is the analysis of Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 3 to 5. Now let's analyze verses 6 to 7 of the same chapter. Would someone like to read those verses?
Habakkuk 3, 6 to 7. He stood and measured the earth. He looked at and startled the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. His ways were everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian tremble.
Now, what does measuring mean in the Bible? What does measuring have to do with the judgment? Now, the measuring of the earth mentioned in Habakkuk represents the execution of judgment. You can refer to Ezekiel 40 to 48, Matthew 27, verse 29, Revelation 11, 1, right? And Revelation 21, 15 and 16, Zechariah 2, 1 to 2, and Matthew 7, 2, and Luke 6, 8. It refers to the execution of God's judgment. Let's read Matthew 7, verses 1 and 2.
Matthew 7, verses 1 to 3. Judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you.
Okay, so there we have the word measure, which refers to judging, right? So Matthew clearly tells us this is symbolic repetition in Hebrew writing. So it says, judge not, don't be measured. So measuring represents to be judged, right? It represents judging. And in chapter 3 of Habakkuk, the moment has arrived for God to execute the judgment for which Habakkuk has clamored in verses chapter 1, verses 2 to 4 and 13, right? In the day of execution, the nations will tremble, and the literal mountains, which represent kingdom in prophecy, that's why it calls the everlasting mountains will be scattered, perpetual hills bowed, right? That is talking about the nations. They will tremble, and then even literal mountains, which represent kingdoms, will crumble and collapse. Because when Jesus comes, all earthly system will cease to be, right? So measuring means that God is coming in judgment. He's coming to execute judgment upon those who have been intent on destroying God's people, right? Is that clear, the symbolism? When we understand the symbolism, the chapter has a lot of meaning. Now, let's read Habakkuk 3, 18 to 15. Let me read that. The Lord, were you displeased with the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea? That you rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. Selah. You divided the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered its voice and lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of your arrows they went. At the shining of your glittering spear, you marched through the land in indignation. You trampled the nations in anger. You went forth from the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed. You struck the head from the house of the wicked by laying bare from the foundation to the neck, Selah. You thrust through with his own arrows the head of his villagers. They came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was like feasting on the poor in secret. You walked through the seas with your horses, through the heap of great water. What a description, right? Now let us analyze more carefully these verses 8 to 15. In order to understand them, we must remember that Habakkuk appeals to the past to inspire faith for the future. So he appeals to the past and what God did to give faith for those, to inspire faith for those in the future. The past serves as an example for the future. These verses employ the imagery of creation and the deliverance of Israel at the Red Sea. They contain elements of memory and of hope. Habakkuk expects that God will repeat what happened at creation when he defeated the darkness and subjected to the waters, placing man on dry land. He also intends to remind us that God will repeat on a larger scale the deliverance of of Israel at the Red Sea. They contain elements of memory and hope. Now Habakkuk expects that God will repeat what happened at creation when he defeated darkness and subjected the water, placing man on dry land. He also intends to remind us that God will repeat on a larger scale the deliverance of Israel at the Red Sea when God shone upon them like the noonday sun and split the waters, creating a dry path for God's people to escape. Now here's something very interesting. It bears noting that Habakkuk did not believe the pagan cosmology of ancient nations. Now the ancient nations had a concept that the sea was actually a dragon. Okay? And that God at creation, he split the dragon in two and then he created the dry earth. And that Habakkuk did not believe, right? In this polytheistic concept. Why does he use this terminology? Why then does he use this terminology? It is because it was common in his day and people could understand. Now, as a monotheistic prophet, the one who believed that there is only one God, he argued against this pagan concept and transformed them, explaining the splendorous God who dispels darkness. And he says that's not Shamash or Marduk, but rather it is Jehovah, right? So in other words, he's saying to these nations, you got it all wrong. It is not the same cosmic sea God that split open in order to create dry land. He said, no, it's Yahweh or Jehovah. That being spoke it into existence, who's spoken about, right? So once again, remember the waters here are not a literal dragon, but rather they represent symbolically the enemies of God's people. And it is Christ who will be garbed with the glory of Yahweh or the brightness of the Son of Righteousness who will come. Thus the Hebrews used this symbolisms of antiquity, but delivered the symbols from their pagan context and gave them a purely monotheistic one God meaning to it, right? So they use symbols that people could understand, and they explain, no, that is not what it is. This is what, and they gave them that meaning. Now, is that clear? I hope so. Because now we are going to notice some very interesting details. Where in the Old Testament, we have this concept that God is going to take the sea and split it in two. It almost sounds like pagan cosmology, but it is not really. And so we'll read verses 8 and 12. When we read verses 8 and 12, we'll find that this passage that we read describes the Lord coming with force. His glory fills the heaven. He comes to trample the winepress. The winepress represents the wicked, right? In his wrath, that is God's unmingled wrath of God, unmingled with his mercy, which are the 7 last plagues, right? He rides victorious upon his chariots. And we have studied what chariots are in an earlier lesson. Chariots represent God's angels, right? Psalms 29 and 46, right? And then we compare the raging of the nations to the raging of waters. And the raging is both literal and symbolic at the second coming. So in the at this time, it was at the second coming, the raging of waters will be the wicked people, as well as the literal sea will be raging, because there will be thunders and lightnings and earthquakes. And obviously, you will be having tsunamis, because when that's an earthquake that has never been seen on this earth, it will displace islands. So it will be there literally as well as symbolically during the second coming. Okay, let's move on. Now notice, this is based on a tremendous article that was written by Herbert May. Now Herbert May wrote a very perspective article on the symbolic meaning of waters in the Old Testament. Now we're going to understand what the waters means. We're going to go to the Bible, right? This author understands verse 15 as a direct reference to the struggle of Yahweh with his enemy. God's intervention in favor of Israel is pictured as crushing the head of the sea dragon. The sea dragon is, if it's tumultuous, wicked people, then crushing it is destroying their power. May compares the Habakkuk passage to the crushing of the head of Rahab in Psalms 89 verses 9 to 11, where crushing of Rahab's head is synonymous with the scattering of his enemy. So let's read Psalms 89 verses 9 to 11 and see what David had to say there. Okay, it says that. Yeah, go ahead, read it.
Psalms 89, 9 to 11. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You have broken Rahab in pieces as one who is slain. You have scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. The heavens are yours. The earth also is yours. The world and all its fullness you have found there.
Okay. Now in antiquity, Rahab was the unruly ocean. So here it's using terminology similar to what was used in the surrounding nations, right? So remember, these are terms that the people during Habakkuk's time understood, right? They could relate to. God's victory over the raging sea, which in antiquity the pagans believed was the unruly waters of a sea dragon. The Bible takes that and it expresses the idea the dragon is not really the sea. The sea is a symbol of the body of the dragon, which is actually multitudes, nations, tongues, and people, right? Now, many refer to such passages as Isaiah 51, 8 to 10, and 17, 12 to 13 to show that Yahweh must subdue and control the insurgent elements of chaos. He must destroy his enemies in order for a new age to come, for him to establish his kingdom. Let's read Isaiah 51, 8 to 10. Abhisha, would you like to read that?
Isaiah 51, 8 to 10. For the moth will eat them up like a garment, and the worm will eat them like wool. But my righteousness will be forever, and my salvation from generation to generation. Awake, awake, put on strength, arm of the Lord. Awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Are you not the arm that cut Rahab apart and wounded the serpent? Are you not the one who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, that made the depths of the sea a road for the redeemed to cross over?
So, by the way, another name for Rahab or the dragon is Leviathan. Okay, we have heard of Leviathan. We did a whole lesson on Leviathan. So I'm going to just mention that in passing. Leviathan is a sea creature that rules over the sea, and he's so-called in Job 41, the king of the children of pride. Very interesting, right? So Leviathan actually is another name for the dragon, and the dragon is taken as we know, right? So there are many different names used to depict the power of evil, right? So here we have Rahab, we have Leviathan, we have the dragon, right? Which all represents the power of evil. Now, Isaiah chapter 17, verses 12 to 13, this tell us who the waters are, describe the waters. We usually use Revelation 7:15 to depict or explain what the waters represent, and that the waters that the harlot sits upon, right? By the way, the harlot is sitting upon a dragon, right? In Revelation 17, she's sitting on a seven-headed dragon. But then it says she's sitting on the water. So then the waters are represented by the dragon. The dragon represents the waters and life. Only the waters are not a literal dragon. They symbolize the multitudes of peoples, nations, tongues, peoples all over the world that Satan uses to accomplish his purpose. Now, Isaiah 17, 12 to 13 is the best text in the Bible to interpret what waters represent. It's even better than Revelation 17, 15. An excellent example of the synonymous nature of water and the enemies of Yahweh's people, right? It's found in Isaiah 17, verses 12 to 13, where the adversaries of God's people are compared to many waters. Let's read that. Amisha, would you like to read that for us?
All right, Isaiah 17, 12 to 13. Woe to the multitude of many people who make a noise like the roar of the sea, and to the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters. The nations will rush like the rushing of many waters. But God will rebuke them, and they will flee far away and be chased like chaff of the mountains before the wind, like a rolling thing before the whirlwind.
So the rushing of the seas, what does it represent? So when you find seas in prophecy, rushing, tumultuous seas, it represents nations in tumult, fighting. Now, when you even go to Daniel 2, the image, they fight to conquer. They conquer. So there is a lot of fighting. There is a lot of tumult. So these waters are not calm waters, right? Not calm people that the harlot sits on, right? She doesn't sit on calm people. They are tumultuous, fighting waters that want to destroy God's people. And then God will rebuke them. And how? By talking about drying them up. If God dries them up, can they be tumultuous and they won't be there, right? Now, according to May, this is what he says. The enemies are manifestations of the insurgent elements which had been quelled by Yahweh before creation, would begin and which must ever be defeated as he continues his activity in history. Now, the victory over Leviathan, Rahab, the insurgent waters, these tumultuous fighting waters, represent the conquest of Yahweh or Jehovah over the enemies of Israel. And Israel are God's chosen people, his remnant, whether at the Red Sea or in the present or at the beginning of the new age. It is a victory over all evil, wickedness, over the demonic, or more properly, the draconic, right? Draconic, the wickedness of the people. Whether the struggle is in the past, present, or future, the struggle is essentially one battle of God against the waters which threaten his rule. That is the great controversy between Christ and Satan, against good and evil, right? And after the conflict, God sits enthroned above the waters above his feet. Is that clear? Are the symbols clear to your mind, so that when you read this, at once you could identify with the symbols and the passage becomes clear? So the Bible compares the dragon to an ocean of tumultuous sea, right? Water. That's the body of Satan. Those are his followers. The sea is the body of Satan, of Leviathan, who rules over the children or the sons of evil, or in other words, the wicked. The wicked are controlled by Satan, right? To put it simply. Now Alexander Hedel was an archaeologist and a historian. He translated the mythical creation story Enuma Elish. And what he translated was correct when he wrote that God did not actually fight with mythical dragons as the ancients believed. For the Hebrews, they were simply figures of speech. They picked up the terminology and applied it symbolically, not literally, to it. So let me read what it says here. Rahab and Leviathan are properly terms of real animals, but they also are employed for imaginary creatures closely resembling the animals with which these names originated. We cannot conclude that the Lord is anywhere represented as actually at war with monsters, as is Murdoch in Enuma Elish. The term under consideration are mere figures of speech applied to powerful nations which are hostile to the Lord or his people. So he understood that. He said this is just figure of speech used to explain that the war between God and the hostile people towards God and his people. Okay, now let's go to verses 13 to 15. These verses describe the persecution of God's people as the reason why God will destroy his enemies. The reason why God is going to destroy his enemies is because the wicked are persecuting God's people. Avisha, would you like to read that?
Habakkuk 3:13 to 15. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. With his own spear you pierced his head. And when his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour the wretched who were in hiding, you trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters.
So remember, this is all symbolism, right? So you came out to deliver. That refers to Daniel 12:1, your people to save with, right? To save with your anointed one. You crushed the leader, that is Satan, of the land of the wicked. You stripped him from head to foot. That means all his allies died with him. He had no helpers, right? And with his own spear, you pierced his head. When his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour the wretched who were in hiding, you trample the sea. Trample means, remember, it's talking about trampling the winepress. That is referring back to how God will bring judgment on the wicked with the 7 last plagues, right? And so here we read in the Bible, remember once again that Habakkuk is dealing, in Habakkuk, this chapter we are dealing with symbols. So when we read the Bible, we have to place ourselves in the context of the writer. Habakkuk is writing, we have to think like him in his time, in his geographical location. And when we understand what the Bible writers are using the terminology, but they're delivering it from a pagan connotation. So they're using pagan symbols, but they're delivering it from that context. They're telling, no, this is not what is happening with this symbol. This is Yahweh, this is what he's doing. And they're using it as a teaching vehicle symbolically. Then it makes sense, all the sense in the word. So they're saying this, you think this, but this is not what you think. This is the correct thing. This is what God is going to do. So they use the same pagan symbols, but they explain it as how your Yahweh or God will, Jehovah will do. Now moving on to verse 16 to 19. Would you like to read that as well?
Habakkuk 3:16 to 19. I heard and my heart pounded, my lips quivered, and the sound decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nations invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fail and the fields produce no fruit, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights.
Okay, now Habakkuk then here is describing his emotions as he beholds the time of trouble, right? Through which God's people will pass before their final deliverance. So here he's telling, he's seeing this and he's emotionally how it affects him. So we find Habakkuk here is totally shaken by what he saw in this vision. The tumultuous sea, the darkness, the second coming of Christ, with the armies of heaven and the horses to trample the wicked and to deliver God's people, right? There is no food because then the fourth plague of Revelation has totally destroyed vegetation. So he's talking about the time of trouble. When the plagues fall, that is why we are told that God's faithful God will provide for them during that time. But the wicked who are living at that time on earth, they are going to be in deep trouble, right? Deep trouble. That is why we have the three angels' messages telling them Babylon has fallen. Come out of Babylon. Otherwise, this is what is going to happen to you. Okay? Now, after Habakkuk has seen this devastating destruction of the wicked, his body trembles, his lips quiver, he feels weak all over, his steps become unsteady. It is some vision that put Habakkuk into this state of mind, right? And yet, he says that he will quietly wait in faith. After this terrible scene that happens, he says, I will quietly wait in faith, or the time of trouble will ensue when Babylon comes against God's people. Now, Mrs. White employed these verses to describe the time of trouble after the close of probation. This is what she said. Although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall the fruit be in the vine, the labor of the olive shall fail, and the field shall yield no meat. Remember, I just read that. And the flocks shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. By fourth plague destroyed all of that. Yet shall they that fear the Lord, rejoice in the Lord, and joy in the Lord of their salvation. Right? So the people will quietly wait in faith. Now, when it says meat, it doesn't mean food, right? In closing, when it says meat, it doesn't mean raw meat, it means food, right? There won't be meat in the stall. That's what I was trying to say. Now, in closing, Habakkuk expresses the kind of faith that will be needed to stand in this great time of testing. Now, you and I will be, God is gracious, we will have to go through this time of trouble. That's why we are studying these lessons, so that they can prepare us to face that time by preparing to let the Lord lead us, right? He said, God will be the strength of the righteous. Because why? Because they don't depend on their own efforts, but on God's providential protection. So that is what we will take us through the time of trouble, this quietly waiting in faith, knowing that whom we worship will provide for us. Ellen White placed the book of Habakkuk in the context of the second coming, and this is how she comments. She wrote in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 387, this: the sure word of prophecy will meet its final fulfillment in the glorious advent of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The time waiting may seem long, the soul may be oppressed by discouraging circumstances. Many in whom confidence has been placed may fall by the way, but with the prophet who endeavors to encourage Judah in a time of unparalleled apostasy, let us confidently declare, the Lord is in his temple, let all the earth keep silent before him. Let us ever hold in remembrance the cheering message. The vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. And the just shall live by his faith. Right? So these are the words that which is why compared the second coming to. So the just shall live by faith. And that is the faith that we have to build on today. Right? Now, she also quoted several verses from chapter 13 and applied them once again directly to the second coming of Jesus. She says there, and Habakkuk, wrapped in holy vision, beheld his appearance, that is of Jesus. God came from Tema, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise, and his brightness was as the light. He stood and measured the earth. Judgment, remember we spoke about it? He beheld and drove asunder the nation, and the everlasting mountains were scattered, the perpetual hills did bow. His ways are everlasting. Thou dost ride upon thine horses and thy chariots of salvation. The mountains saw thee, and they trembled. The deep uttered his voice and lifted up his hands on high. The sun and the moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of thy arrows they went, and at the shining of thy glittering spear. Thou wentest forth for salvation of thy people, even for the salvation with thine anointed. So here she's once again quoting Habakkuk 3, and she compares it to the second coming of Jesus. Now, critics have claimed that chapter 3 is a work of another author, and that the first 2 chapters were authored by somebody different. They came to this conclusion based on the fact that the literary style and the subject matter of chapter 3 are very different from chapters 1 and 2. However, in light of what we studied just now and what we studied the past 2 weeks, there is perfect unity, right? Chapter 1 refers to the sinfulness of Judah. Remember, we studied that? And the coming of the literal Babylonians against literal Jerusalem in the year 586 BC. However, the chapter is a type of the sinfulness of God's professed people and the final persecution against spiritual Israel by spiritual Babylon at the close of time. So chapters 1 and 2 are typology of what will happen at the end. So that is chapter 1. Now chapter 2 describes the reasons why historical Babylon will be punished, along with apostate Israel. So God will punish apostate Israel by bringing in the Babylonians, and he will punish Babylon for coming against his people, right? Because they were also wicked nations. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 is the link between chapters 1 and 3. Till now, chapter 3 is not typological. It's not a type because it has not happened as yet. Has the second coming happened? Even literally, no. But it directly describes the second coming of Jesus in power and glory. So 1 and 2 are types of what will happen at a greater scale at the end of time. 3 is describing what will actually take place at the end of time. Then we find God speaks to man in the language of man. Right? God speaks to man in the language of man. He uses the images and symbols that were common in that day, in those days when the prophets wrote, so that the people could identify with them and understand. Right? In Habakkuk, we have 3 perspectives. The original historical paradigm, as illustrated in the natural world at creation, the typological historical fulfillment, and then the final eschatological fulfillment. The framework of nature is used as a vehicle to explain the final eschatological fulfillment at the second coming of Jesus. Chapter 3 will respond to Habakkuk's 2 questions. In chapter 1, God will execute judgment upon apostate Israel and the wicked Babylonians who oppress his faithful remnant. Now remember what Habakkuk's question was. He says, Lord, how long will wicked Israel continue like this? And then God says, I will bring Babylon. Then he says, Lord, why are you bringing a far worse wicked nation to destroy a less wicked nation? Right? So chapter 3 is a response to those questions that Habakkuk asked of God. So is it clear? Do you understand the book of Habakkuk now?